It happened almost overnight. Mexico didn't just respond to Trump's tariffs. They triggered an economic earthquake. Factories across the United States shut down. Thousands of workers were sent home. Dealerships sat empty, and for the first time in modern history, America's auto industry is no longer in control. Will car prices spiral even higher? Are the Midwest factory layoffs just the beginning of a nationwide collapse? And has Mexico's move permanently flipped who controls the global auto supply chain? What's happening? When the government of Mexico announced a sudden halt on the export of critical automobile parts to the United States, the move instantly destabilized an industry that had spent decades optimizing a delicate, cross-border supply network. These parts, wiring harnesses, transmissions, engine assemblies, are not generic components. They are tailor-made, precision-calibrated products that American factories cannot simply substitute with domestic replacements. For more than 30 years, manufacturers like General Motors, Ford, Stellantis, and Tesla have leveraged Mexico's reliable infrastructure, low labor costs, and geographical proximity to streamline vehicle production. Within hours of the announcement, key assembly lines in the United States began running on borrowed time. Inventories thinned out by the hour. Without Mexico's daily supply of parts, American factories lost their ability to function. And the numbers were staggering. Industry analysts estimated that nearly $219.5 billion in export value, including parts, vehicles, and related services, was immediately thrown into chaos. As the dust settled from the initial blow, the reality was clear. This was no mere disruption. This was a full-scale collapse of one of America's most iconic economic engines. But what came next was even more devastating. The heartland goes dark. The first signs of collapse emerged from the American Midwest. Factories across Michigan, Ohio, and Kentucky, states that had once symbolized the strength of American manufacturing, began announcing emergency shutdowns. Production halted. Workers sent home. Entire communities thrown into economic uncertainty. Ford was the first to blink. By the third day of the parts freeze, its Michigan assembly plant suspended operations indefinitely. Within 72 hours, General Motors followed suit, citing the unavailability of specialized components from Monterrey and Puebla. Stellantis was next, closing down 2 major facilities in Ohio and Kentucky. The layoffs came swiftly and mercilessly. Thousands of blue-collar workers found themselves without paychecks, and even worse, without answers. For many of these employees, loyalty to the industry had spanned generations. Their fathers and grandfathers had built the American dream on the floor of these same factories. Now, that legacy was crumbling. And the emotional toll was just as real. Marriages strained under the weight of job loss. Mortgages fell into default. Mental health clinics reported spikes in stress-related visits. The pain wasn't abstract. It was lived, felt, and deeply personal. And behind it all was one crucial question. How did Mexico manage to cripple an industry so fast? The supply chain graveyard. Mexico had studied America's vulnerabilities for decades. When the counter-strike came, it was swift and targeted. The halt of automobile part exports was not an act of desperation. It was a calculated strike on the arteries of U.S. production. By cutting off key exports like wiring harnesses, specialized sensors, engine blocks, and electronic control modules, Mexico choked the American auto industry without firing a shot. These were not random components. These were high-precision parts made in specialized factories with years of technical refinement behind them. The U.S. had no immediate substitutes. In Mexico, suppliers like Lear Corporation, Bosch Mexico, and Aptiv had long been central to North American manufacturing. Their sudden absence triggered systemic collapse, and the timing was impeccable. At the start of the second quarter, when production was at its annual peak, Mexico pulled the plug. The result? An assembly line graveyard. Dozens of U.S. plants stood idle. Thousands of vehicles were partially built but undeliverable. Executives scrambled to reroute production, but with no logistical blueprint and no short-term replacements, their hands were tied. Mexico's move redefined the concept of economic warfare. Instead of tariffs or sanctions, it used America's own industrial dependence as a weapon, and it worked. The supply chain, once hailed as a triumph of globalized efficiency, was now the very instrument of the nation's economic undoing. The shockwaves from this opening salvo were only the beginning. Tariffs set off a chain reaction that detonated America's most fragile industrial system: automobile manufacturing. American automakers, who had built their supply chains over decades with precision and partnership, found themselves in a logistical nightmare. Parts critical to production, from wire harnesses to transmission components, were held hostage behind a suddenly expensive border. Assembly lines that depended on just-in-time delivery schedules began missing components. And when one piece fails in a tightly synchronized system, the entire machine stalls. Instead of triggering investment, the tariffs created uncertainty. Automakers froze hiring. Production plans were delayed. Capital investments were scrapped. Foreign investors looked elsewhere, and Wall Street analysts sounded alarms. For every dollar the tariffs were supposed to protect, billions were wiped from auto industry valuations. Ironically, the very workers Trump claimed to defend became the first casualties: furloughed, laid off, or facing collapsed factories. From Michigan to Texas and from Ontario to Chihuahua, the auto economy didn't experience revival. It went into shock, and this was just the beginning. As the industry scrambled for answers, it became clear that there was no quick solution. No way out. The plan to bring production back to the United States sounded simple. Just move the factories, build the parts here, employ American workers. But beneath the slogans was a mountain of logistical, economic, and human barriers too complex to overcome. And it didn't take long for the cracks in the dream to show. To begin with, building modern manufacturing plants in the United States is not an overnight process. It takes years of permitting, construction, and testing to create facilities that can meet the precision demands of automobile manufacturing. Skilled labor, once abundant in places like Detroit, is now spread thin across emerging industries. Thousands of factory workers who were laid off in past decades have retired, retrained, or moved away. Simply hiring more people isn't an option when the talent doesn't exist anymore. Moreover, producing components domestically comes with a price tag. Labor in the United States is significantly more expensive than in Mexico. Healthcare, insurance, and regulatory compliance inflate every dollar spent on American production. In contrast, Mexico offers not only lower costs but also integrated supplier networks and tax incentives that make cross-border trade efficient and competitive. So instead of a grand return of industrial might, what emerged was paralysis. Production lines sat idle, executives faced impossible math, and communities once promised economic revitalization found themselves waiting for factories that would never come. The situation only worsened when the ripple effects began to spread. The ripple effect. Automobile manufacturing is not an isolated industry. It is the beating heart of a vast economic network that stretches into steel mills, silicon foundries, glass processors, chemical refineries, and beyond. When that heart stops, the entire body suffers. And by the second month of Mexico's counterstrike, the symptoms were everywhere. In Pittsburgh, steel mills started laying off workers as automaker orders evaporated. In California, electronic suppliers halted deliveries for onboard navigation systems and battery modules. Across the South, companies that produce tires, seats, brake components, and dashboards reported double-digit losses. Trucking companies saw contracts vanish. Railroads that once hauled cross-border cargo ran trains with half-empty cars. Retail wasn't spared either. Auto dealerships with tight inventory began to shutter service departments as parts became unavailable. Rental companies, unable to refresh aging fleets, hiked prices and reduced services. Rideshare platforms saw rising customer complaints as wait times increased and car availability dropped. Even small-town economies suffered. Cafes, dry cleaners, and gas stations near manufacturing plants saw business disappear overnight. Families who once lived comfortably on auto industry paychecks were now lining up for unemployment assistance. Entire communities began to resemble economic ghost towns. Meanwhile, financial analysts started downgrading multiple industries linked to automotive supply. Investor confidence dipped, credit ratings were slashed, and the threat of a broader industrial recession loomed. For over 30 years, the United States, Mexico, and Canada had operated under a fragile but functional economic alliance. The North American Free Trade Agreement, replaced by the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, created one of the most efficient automotive ecosystems on the planet. Components would cross borders multiple times before becoming a finished vehicle. It worked because there was trust, consistency, and shared benefit. But Trump's tariffs and Mexico's counterstrike destroyed that balance. What had once been a unified North American manufacturing zone quickly splintered into distrust and retaliation. Canadian suppliers, fearing the same fate as Mexico, began shifting trade agreements toward Europe and Asia. Mexican factories, once deeply integrated with U.S. firms, started signing long-term deals with Chinese and Brazilian automakers. The collapse wasn't symbolic, it was systemic. Warehouses once used to stage cross-border logistics were sold or abandoned. Cross-border trucking operations shut down. Trade attorneys, once in high demand for negotiating supply chain contracts, were now overwhelmed with breach of contract cases. In political terms, the dream of a North American manufacturing powerhouse was over. Mexico learned it could survive without the U.S. auto industry. Canada realized it needed to diversify. And the United States, the original architect of this trilateral system, found itself standing alone, isolated by policies that broke the very foundation they were supposed to protect. As we move deeper into the crisis, the personal toll only grows darker. When your car becomes a luxury, the consumer price explosion. For decades, owning a car symbolized freedom for the American middle class. But now, it represents a financial burden that millions can no longer bear. As factory production halted and inventories dried up, the price of both new and used cars soared to historic highs. Cars that once cost $25,000 were now selling for over $35,000. Used cars that previously sat on lots for weeks were being auctioned off for eye-watering sums. Rental agencies faced their own disaster. With no new vehicles entering their fleets and many older ones aging out, they began jacking up prices just to survive. A simple weekend rental that might have cost $150 now topped $400. Rideshare companies faced shortages too, leading to longer wait times and higher fares across the board. But perhaps the most damaging shift came for the working class. In rural and suburban areas where public transit is limited or non-existent, a car isn't a luxury, it's a necessity. When families couldn't replace a failing vehicle, they faced difficult choices: miss work, risk unsafe repairs, or take on debt at predatory interest rates. Car maintenance services also saw prices rise. Replacement parts became scarce. Oil changes were backlogged. A broken timing belt, a fix that once cost $800, now ran over $1,500. For many Americans, reliable transportation slipped just out of reach. And as mobility declined, so did economic opportunity. The American dream, once driven by four wheels and open roads, was now stuck in neutral. The new Detroit across America. From Flint to Fort Wayne, a chilling transformation began to unfold. Entire towns were becoming what economists now call modern industrial deserts. The sound of pneumatic tools and humming conveyor belts gave way to boarded-up windows and empty parking lots. This wasn't just about auto plants anymore. It was about every business and job that surrounded them. Tool and die shops closed their doors. Auto parts suppliers laid off staff. Cafes that once served dozens of factory workers each morning were now shuttered. The local tax base shrank overnight, slashing school funding and public services. Police and fire departments reported slower response times due to budget cuts. Libraries reduced hours. In some towns, entire streets went dark as municipalities could no longer afford to keep the lights on. Young people moved away in search of opportunity. Property values plummeted. Home foreclosures surged. Local banks froze lending, fearing defaults. It was a self-reinforcing loop of decline. Experts had warned that disrupting the North American supply chain could create pockets of collapse. But no one anticipated just how fast it would happen. The new Detroits were no longer just in Michigan. They stretched into Texas, Indiana, Illinois, and even upstate New York. Each of them told the same story: a thriving community gutted by one strategic blow. And all of it in the name of economic nationalism that had spiraled out of. The numbers were staggering. Over 300,000 jobs lost, a 58% drop in vehicle output, a 71% decline in cross-border automotive trade. But those statistics only scratch the surface. Behind every percentage point was a person, a household, a story of disintegration. Local hospitals reported spikes in stress-related illnesses. Mental health services were overwhelmed. Divorce filings increased, so did opioid overdoses. For many affected workers, the collapse wasn't just financial, it was psychological. The just-in-time manufacturing system, once hailed as a marvel of efficiency, turned out to be America's greatest vulnerability. With zero inventory cushion, there was no room for error. And when Mexico turned off the tap, the system didn't just falter, it broke. Dealerships turned into empty lots. Assembly plants became ghost facilities. And workers were left asking, how did it all fall apart so fast? The truth is, the collapse was always possible. It just took the right spark. And that spark came when tariffs collided with interdependence. A policy designed to punish another nation ended up punishing Americans first. Mexico's power play. What began as a counterpunch quickly became a redefinition of the entire global trade landscape. When Mexico retaliated against the United States by halting the export of critical automobile components, it was not just about economic revenge. It was a strategic masterstroke that revealed how deeply intertwined the world had become, and how fragile America's place in it really was. By choosing to disrupt the lifeline that powered Detroit's production lines, Mexico forced not only an industrial pause, but a geopolitical pivot. The message was simple. The era of unquestioned American industrial dominance was over. As factories in Michigan, Ohio, and Kentucky stalled, the silence on the factory floors was filled by new sounds from across the ocean. Europe, already bruised from Trump's earlier trade wars, saw an opportunity. Germany quietly accelerated its partnerships with Mexico, rerouting trade routes and jointly funding new auto zones that excluded American suppliers. At the same time, Chinese automakers, long searching for ways into the Western Hemisphere, found a new partner in Mexico's thriving logistics infrastructure. Trade delegations were fast-tracked, bilateral deals were signed, manufacturing plans once sketched for the southern United States were redrawn for Querétaro and Guanajuato. Perhaps most symbolically, South American nations, historically overshadowed by American influence, now embraced Mexico as a partner in regional supply chain resilience. Brazil, Argentina, and Chile began negotiations on regional EV battery production and rail corridor expansions linking South America to Mexican ports. What emerged was a quiet but unmistakable shift in global alignment. With the United States paralyzed by its own aggressive posturing, Mexico, once seen as a junior partner, became a linchpin in a new global economic web. As America scrambled for damage control, it became increasingly clear the world had learned how to work around the United States. And Mexico had shown them how. Now that the world had changed, the next question was simple. Who really won the trade war? The trade war that broke America. Diplomacy shattered, voters enraged. It was supposed to be a show of strength, an iron-fisted move to bring American manufacturing back home. But instead of sparking an industrial revival, Donald Trump's auto tariffs ignited a political and diplomatic wildfire that left the United States isolated abroad and fractured at home. The strategy had seemed simple: pressure Mexico with sweeping 25% tariffs until companies folded and moved factories back to the US. What actually happened was the opposite. American automakers froze operations, Mexican suppliers found new partners, and the global trade system that had once revolved around Detroit began rotating around someone else. Within weeks, long-standing US allies decided they had had enough. Canada and the European Union, already weary from years of erratic diplomacy and broken trade negotiations, began to look elsewhere for stability. The European Union fast-tracked a non-aligned vehicle accord, a sweeping multilateral deal that offered electric vehicle subsidies to Mexico, Japan, and South Korea while excluding US suppliers. Canada responded in kind, restructuring its electric vehicle tax credits to lock out Detroit's big three automakers entirely. It was a quiet but decisive shift, Allies were no longer waiting for America. They were moving on without. At the World Trade Organization, America faced formal investigations over the legality of its tariff actions. Once the undisputed leader in shaping global economic rules, the United States found itself increasingly sidelined. Germany and France offered no diplomatic cover. Japan abstained from key negotiations. Invitations to international forums were quietly rescinded. The country that had once authored the blueprint for modern capitalism now looked like a rogue actor, driven by short-term political vengeance rather than long-term strategy. But while the diplomatic collapse unfolded on the world stage, an even more explosive reaction was building inside the country. The very voters who had once cheered Trump's promises to bring jobs back suddenly found themselves betrayed. Across the Midwest, in states like Ohio, Michigan, and Indiana, thousands of auto workers lost their jobs. And they didn't just lose paychecks, they lost purpose, they lost trust, and they lost patience. Union halls, which had cautiously supported Trump's tough-on-trade rhetoric, became battlegrounds of frustration. Laid-off workers organized protests outside shuttered factories. Local news outlets aired emotional interviews with families suddenly thrust into crisis. United Auto Workers leaders issued damning statements, accusing the administration of gambling with their livelihoods for political points. Factory towns that had once been Trump strongholds began to turn. Cafes that used to display "Make America Great Again" signs quietly took them down. Hardware stores that once echoed with political pride now echoed with silence. Conservative talk radio, once solidly in Trump's corner, began airing segments with angry workers and disillusioned voters. The very coalition that had propelled Trump to victory, industrial workers, rural voters, blue-collar conservatives, was crumbling under the weight of its own expectations. And in Washington, the panic set in. Republican lawmakers split into factions. Some tried to distance themselves from the fallout, criticizing the tariffs as politically reckless. Others doubled down, blaming Mexico, China, or even the deep state. But none of it could stop the hemorrhaging. The pain was too personal, the collapse too visible. For many in the Midwest, this wasn't just a failed policy. It was a broken promise. Trump may have launched the tariffs to protect American jobs, but in the end, they shattered U.S. credibility abroad, decimated trust at home, and exposed just how interconnected and vulnerable the American auto industry truly is. And now, the question remained: could the American auto industry itself survive the wreckage? The death of U.S. auto power. Once the envy of the industrial world, America's automotive sector now stood on the edge of collapse. The supply chain had been shattered, investor confidence had evaporated, trade alliances were broken, and for the first time in over a century, the United States was no longer the epicenter of global vehicle manufacturing. Production halts at Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis plants had become permanent closures. EV startups like Rivian and Lucid, once poised to challenge Tesla's dominance, were now struggling to stay afloat amid skyrocketing component costs. Tesla itself, once a symbol of American innovation, was hit hardest. With factories idled and exports blocked, the company lost nearly 1/3 of its global market share in under 6 months. Investors fled. The stock market punished every major U.S. automaker. Credit agencies downgraded industry ratings, and foreign automakers, previously cautious about expanding in North America, now avoided the United States entirely. Manufacturing zones popped up in Canada and Mexico instead. In Europe, government incentives explicitly excluded American brands. In Asia, trade pacts were redrawn to favor regional players. Economically, the damage was generational. Thousands of small businesses across the American Rust Belt closed their doors. University research programs tied to auto tech lost funding. Entire regions once known for industrial prowess were now known for unemployment and decay. And yet, the question lingered. Could the United States rebuild what had been lost? Some analysts argued it was possible, but only with radical reform. A complete reshuffling of supply chain strategies, a commitment to domestic manufacturing incentives, and above all, a restoration of diplomatic ties that had been severed in the name of short-term political gain. But even with such reforms, the path forward would be long, expensive, and auto power was over. Whether a new one could ever rise again remains a question for the history books. The fallout from this trade war is still unraveling, and the consequences are far from over. But what do you think? Did America go too far, or was Mexico's response a long time coming? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. And if you found this breakdown eye-opening, make sure to hit that subscribe button.